Alright, let's go. Number 10. The Dark Galleries of Chavín de Huántar sits at nearly 3,200 meters in the Peruvian Andes, at the point where a trail from the Amazon lowlands meets a trail from the Pacific coast. The temple complex was built in phases starting around 1200 BCE and expanded for close to 1,000 years. From outside, it reads as a stepped stone platform faced with carved heads. Underneath it is a maze. The galleries run through the core of the building in total darkness, narrow enough that two people cannot pass, laced with ducts that channel water and air in ways that still are not fully mapped. At the center of the oldest gallery stands the Lanzón, a granite blade 5 meters tall, carved with a snarling human-feline figure and wedged into the rock so tightly it could never have been placed there after the walls went up. It was built around. The stone that explains the ritual was found nearby. The Tello obelisk, carved with 2 caimans, shows a figure holding a length of cactus with vertical ribs cut into unmistakable segments. Richard Berger, the archaeologist who has led the modern excavation of the site since the 1970s, identified the plant as San Pedro, Trichocereus pachanoi, a columnar cactus that grows locally and contains mescaline in quantities high enough to produce hours of visionary effect. Botanical evidence backs the carving. Excavated plant remains from the site include cactus fragments, and residue analysis on ceramic vessels associated with the galleries has recovered chemical traces consistent with San Pedro preparation. The cactus does not simply grow near Chavín. It was gathered, processed, and consumed inside a building engineered to remove every sense a person could use to orient themselves. That engineering is the argument for what Chavín actually was. John Rick of Stanford University, who took over excavation in the 1990s, has spent decades mapping the acoustic and hydraulic systems built into the galleries. Conch shell trumpets, or pututus, recovered from the passages, produce a low, directionless roar when sounded underground, a sound that cannot be traced to its source by ear. Water channels beneath the floor could be made to run or stop, changing the ambient noise on command. None of it grows food. None of it stores anything. Every element measured so far exists to produce a controlled sensory experience for a small number of people at a time, inside absolute dark, on a compound that dissolves the edges of the visible world. Chavín drew pilgrims from hundreds of kilometers away, evidenced by pottery styles and obsidian sourced to distant quarries turning up in the temple's refuse. People walked for days to reach a mountain valley, to be led one at a time into a stone throat, and given a plant that took the world apart. What they were told when they came out is not recorded. The building was built to make sure of that. If you're into forgotten rituals, ancient mysteries, and discoveries that completely change what we thought we knew about the past, subscribe now. We've only just started, and the next discovery is even stranger. The galleries are open to visitors today. Lit now, mapped now, silent now. The Lanzón is still exactly where it was set, still too large to have entered any other way than being built around, still facing the direction the first priests faced it. Number 9. The White Room at Gonur Depe. Gonur Depe lies in the Karakum Desert of modern Turkmenistan, the ceremonial and administrative center of the Bronze Age culture archaeologists call the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, or BMAC, occupied from roughly 2400 to 1600 BCE. The Soviet and later Russian archaeologist Viktor Saryanidi excavated it for over 3 decades, and inside its walled precinct, he identified a structure he called the Temple of the White Room, a sealed inner sanctum accessible only through a controlled sequence of courtyards. Inside that room were large ceramic vessels, sieves, and strainer-top jars, arranged in a pattern that looked less like storage and more like a brewery built for ritual. Saryanidi proposed the obvious and enormous connection. The Rig Veda, composed in roughly the same period on the other side of the Iranian plateau, describes a sacred drink called soma, pressed, filtered, and consumed by priests to achieve a state in which the gods could be perceived directly. The Avesta, the sacred text of Zoroastrianism, describes an almost identical drink under the name halma. Both traditions treat the plant's identity as a mystery, even to their own later priesthoods. Neither tradition survived with a clear botanical answer. What Gonur Depe offered was residue instead of scripture. Chemical analysis of the vessels, published by the Dutch archaeobotanist Corey Bakkels in 2003, and expanded by subsequent studies of the site's ceramic assemblage, identified traces consistent with ephedra, cannabis, and poppy, sometimes in combination, inside vessels from the temple precinct. Ephedra contains ephedrine and related alkaloids, a stimulant. Cannabis and poppy both carry documented histories of ritual and analgesic use across the ancient Near East and Central Asia. None of the three alone matches every property later text assigned to soma or halma. A mixture might be. The debate over exactly what was in the cups is not settled and may never be. Ephedra grows on the plateau in quantity and was clearly gathered deliberately, since it does not occur naturally inside Gonur's walls. Cannabis seeds were recovered in bulk from a separate area of the site associated with the same ritual complex. What the residue analysis cannot do is tell archaeologists what proportion of each plant went into a given cup on a given night for a given rite 22 centuries before the Avesta was written down. What can be said without qualification is the function of the room. It was sealed. It was accessible only to a defined group. It processed plants with measurable psychoactive effect through equipment purpose-built for the task inside a temple whose priests, on the evidence of the texts that come after them, drank to see something ordinary sight could not reach. The vessels are in the museum in Ashgabat now, empty, their residue already sampled and consumed by the analysis that identified it. Number 8. The felt tent at Pazyryk, in the high valleys of the Altai Mountains, where modern Russia meets Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and China. A series of burial mounds called kurgans were built by Scythian pastoralists starting around the 5th century BCE. The Pazyryk kurgans are the largest and best known of them, excavated in stages between 1929 and 1949 by the Soviet archaeologist Sergei Rudenko. The permafrost of the region did something almost no other archaeological context manages. It froze the burials intact, felt textiles, wooden objects, and organic residue included, rather than leaving only bone and stone. Inside Kurgan 2, Rudenko's team found a small tent frame of 6 wooden poles, arranged to be draped in felt and closed into a dome barely large enough for 2 people to sit inside. Beside it sat a bronze censer holding stones, and next to that, a leather pouch. The stones were scorched. The pouch, when analyzed, contained hemp seeds. This matched a text that had been treated as traveler's exaggeration for over 2,000 years. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described the Scythians building exactly this apparatus, a small tent draped in felted cloth, with hot stones placed inside a vessel at its center. He wrote that the Scythians threw hemp seed onto the stones, that it produced a vapor no Greek steam bath could match, and that the people inside howled with pleasure at the effect. Rudenko's excavation put an actual censer, actual scorched stones, and actual cannabis seeds directly into the frame of an actual tent. In undisturbed burial, dated to within a few centuries of when Herodotus was writing, later analysis pushed the picture further. Seed content and cannabinoid concentration recovered from Pazyryk and related Altai kurgans indicate the plant material came from cultivated, high-resin hemp rather than the low-potency wild hemp that grows across the steppe as a weed. Someone was selecting for it. Whether the ritual was purely funerary, a rite performed only at burial to send the dead into whatever came next, or a wider practice used by ritual specialists among the living for trance and divination, is argued over by specialists in Scythian archaeology to this day, since the frozen tents survive only from graves. What is not argued over is that a specific technology for altering consciousness, described by a Greek writer as something almost unbelievable, was found built, used, and buried exactly as he said, in a mountain range he almost certainly never saw himself. The tent poles are in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. The felt has been conserved. The censer sits beside it, its stones still carrying the burn pattern of a fire that went out roughly 24 centuries ago. Number 7. The Seeress at Fyrkat. Fyrkat is a Viking Age ring fortress in northern Jutland, Denmark, one of a network of circular strongholds built under King Harald Bluetooth in the 980s. Outside its earthworks, in a cemetery serving the fortress, Danish archaeologists in the 1950s excavated a grave that did not match the others around it. The woman inside had been buried with unusual wealth, a silver toe ring, imported textiles, and a small bronze bowl containing traces of fat, thought to be the remains of a preparation applied to the body or burned as part of the funeral. Beside her lay an iron staff, roughly a meter long, wrapped originally in a fabric that has since decayed, its shape resembling a distaff, the tool used in spinning wool, except made deliberately too fragile and too ornamented to have spun anything. Similar staffs, found in a small number of other Norse graves across Scandinavia and the Norse settlements of the North Atlantic, are now interpreted by archaeologists including Neil Price, whose work has become the standard synthesis on Viking ritual practice as the physical tool of a vulva, a female ritual specialist practicing a form of prophetic sorcery. The sagas called Seithr. Old Norse literature describes Seithr in detail, most famously in Eirik's Saga Rotha, where a vulva named Thorbjörg is summoned to a farm in famine-struck Greenland, seated on a high platform, and sung into a trance by a chorus of women, so that she can answer questions about the future, the fate of individuals present, and the coming harvest. The saga is explicit that the ritual required a particular chant, that the seeress needed help to reach the state she worked in, and that what she said afterward was treated as reliable knowledge of things not yet decided. The Fyrkat grave adds a chemical detail the sagas do not mention. The small pouch found near the woman's body contained henbane seeds, Hyoscamus niger, a plant containing scopolamine and hyoscyacyamine, tropane alkaloids capable of producing vivid hallucination, disorientation, and a sensation of flight at the doses available from burning or ingesting the seed, alongside toxicity that makes the margin for the ritual specialist, using it genuinely dangerous. Henbane grows across Scandinavia as a weed of disturbed ground. It does not need to be imported or cultivated to be available. It does need to be recognized, gathered selectively, and handled by someone who already knows what it does. Whether the henbane at Fyrkat was used in the seance itself, burned as incense inside a ritual space, ingested to reach trance, or included purely as a grave good marking the woman's profession, without necessarily reflecting the exact method of a working Seithr rite, is a question the archaeology alone cannot answer, since the seeds were found with the body, rather than in a vessel that shows clear signs of use. The saga account and the archaeological find were made independently of each other, centuries apart in origin, and they now sit next to each other, pointing at the same practice from two different directions. Fyrkat is not the only find of its kind, which is part of why archaeologists take it seriously, rather than treating it as a single, unrepeatable curiosity. Comparable iron staffs, generally interpreted the same way, have been recovered from graves in Sweden, Norway, and Norse-settled Iceland, most dating to the 9th and 10th centuries, and a smaller number of those burials have also produced henbane or other tropane alkaloid plant material alongside them. The pattern is thin, since these are rare, high-status burials to begin with, but it repeats across a wide geographic range for the culture, which argues against any single grave being an anomaly. The staff is in the National Museum of Denmark. It has never been proven to have been used for anything except being buried with a woman the community around Fyrkat clearly believed could tell them what was going to happen. Number 6. The Altars of Tel Arad. Tel Arad sits in the Negev desert of southern Israel, a fortified settlement with a small shrine built into its wall during the Iron Age, roughly the 8th century BCE, under the Kingdom of Judah. The shrine is a scaled-down version of the layout later texts described for the Jerusalem Temple, a courtyard, a main hall, and an inner sanctum, with two limestone altars standing side by side just outside the sanctum's entrance. The site was excavated between 1962 and 1967 by the Israeli archaeologist Yohanan Aharoni, and the two altars were removed to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, where they sat for decades with a dark residue on their upper surfaces that nobody had the tools to properly identify. In 2020, a team led by Aaron Airy of the Israel Museum, working with the organic chemists Devory Namdar and Baruch Rosen, ran modern residue analysis on that surface material for the first time, and published the results in the journal Tel Aviv. The two altars carried different substances. The larger altar showed frankincense mixed with animal fat, a combination that would burn at a temperature, releasing the resin's aromatic compounds cleanly, matching what biblical texts describe as ordinary incense offering. The smaller altar showed something else entirely. Cannabis residue, mixed with animal dung, which the researchers noted would have been added specifically to keep the plant material smoldering at a low, sustained temperature, rather than burning it away too fast, releasing THC into the air of the enclosed shrine over an extended period rather than in a single burst. This is the earliest confirmed physical evidence of cannabis use in the archaeology of the ancient Levant, and its presence inside a Judahite shrine complicates a picture that biblical texts present as consistently hostile to anything resembling foreign ritual intoxicants. The excavators were careful in how they framed the conclusion. They did not claim the cannabis was necessarily linked to prophecy or divination in any documented sense. What they established is narrower and still significant. A substance capable of altering the state of anyone breathing the shrine's air was burned deliberately, prepared specifically to smolder rather than combust, on an altar, standing at the threshold of the space where the community's priests approached the presence of their god. The shrine at Arad went out of use sometime before the site's final destruction, deliberately dismantled and buried under later construction rather than left to decay, in a pattern some archaeologists read as a religious reform that closed regional shrines in favor of centralized worship in Jerusalem. Whatever the reason, someone chose to bury the altars rather than destroy them. They survived under that fill for roughly 27 centuries before Aharon's team found them, residue intact, waiting for equipment sensitive enough to read it. Number 5. The mushroom stones of the Highlands. Across the highlands of Guatemala, Chiapas, and El Salvador, farmers digging foundations and archaeologists running formal excavations have, since the early 20th century, been turning up a category of carved stone object with no clear practical use. They stand between 15 and 30 centimeters tall, a stem rising to a distinct cap, unmistakably shaped like a mushroom, and in the better preserved examples, the stem is carved into a crouching human or animal figure supporting the cap on its back. The earliest confidently dated examples come from contexts around 1000 BCE, in the pre-classic period, well over 2,000 years before the Spanish conquest. The Guatemalan archaeologist Stefan de Borjegi, working through the 1950s and 1960s, was the first to argue systematically that the objects were not decorative but ritual, tied to the ceremonial use of psilocybin-containing mushrooms, and he connected the stones forward in time to a practice documented in vivid detail by Spanish chroniclers after the conquest. The Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún, compiling the Florentine Codex from testimony given by Nahua elders in the 1500s, recorded that the Aztec called a specific mushroom tionanacatl, flesh of the gods, and that it was eaten by ritual specialists during ceremonies, producing visions that were treated as messages, sometimes including warnings of coming events, or the fates of individuals under discussion. The mycologist R. Gordon Wasson, working with his wife Valentina Pavlovna Wasson, and later with the ethnobotanist Blas Pablo Reyco, traveled to Oaxaca in the 1950s and located a living tradition of exactly this practice among Mazatec curanderas, most famously the healer Maria Sabina, who conducted an all-night velada ceremony for Wasson using psilocybe mushrooms in 1955. Wasson's account, published in Life magazine in 1957, connected a documented living ritual directly back to the Florentine Codex's description, and, through de Borjegi's stone carvings, back further still to objects made 1,000 years before the Codex existed. The chain is unusually long for archaeology, spanning a carved stone from the Preclassic, a 16th century ethnographic record compiled from oral testimony after the practice had already been driven underground by colonial religious suppression, and a mid-20th century ceremony conducted for an outside observer. Each link has been questioned independently. Some archaeologists argue de Borjegi over-interpreted objects whose function cannot be proven from the stone alone, since no residue analysis has ever been run on a mushroom stone in the way it has on the vessels at Gonur Depe or the altars at Arad. What is not in dispute is the codex and the living tradition it can be shown to describe accurately, and the continuity of a mushroom stone tradition produced in the same highland region. For over 1,000 years before either was recorded, Maria Sabina died in 1985, in the same mountains where the stones were carved. She had spent her final years watched by a stream of outside visitors drawn by Wasson's article, a level of attention, she said, before she died, had taken something from the ceremony that could not be given back. Number 4. the bundle from Cueva del Chileno, in a rock shelter in the Lipez region of southwestern Bolivia. At an altitude above 3,900 meters, a leather bag was found tucked into a crevice, wrapped and undisturbed, sometime before the site came to the attention of researchers. The bag and its contents were eventually studied by an international team led by the archaeologist Jose Capriles of Pennsylvania State University, working with Juan Albarracin Jordan and colleagues, and the results were published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2019. Radiocarbon dating placed the bundle at approximately 1000 CE, associated with the Tiwanaku-influenced cultures of the south-central Andes in the centuries before the rise of the Inca. Inside the fox snout pouch, made from 3 fox snouts stitched together, the team found a wooden snuff tablet carved with an anthropomorphic figure, a snuff tube, a spatula, a headband, and a woven textile bag, all wrapped for transport by a single individual, almost certainly a ritual specialist who carried it personally over long distances. What made the find extraordinary was not the objects, but what was inside and on them. Chemical analysis identified traces of cocaine and benzoylecgonine from coca. It identified harmine and related beta-carboline alkaloids from Banisteriopsis caapi, the vine used across South America as a component of ayahuasca. It identified bufotenine and dimethyltryptamine, DMT, from Anadenanthera seeds, the same seed genus, used across the Andes and Amazon for psychoactive snuff for millennia, and it identified traces consistent with psilocybin. 4 separate classes of psychoactive compound from at least 3 separate plant sources, plus a possible 4th, in a single kit carried by a single person. Capriles and his colleagues were direct about the significance. No single previous archaeological find had demonstrated this range of substances together in one ritual context anywhere in the Americas. The combination also solved a chemical puzzle that had stood unresolved in ethnobotany for decades. DMT is not orally active on its own, since an enzyme in the human gut breaks it down before it can act on the brain. It becomes active by mouth only when taken alongside a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and harmine, present in the same pouch from a completely different plant, is exactly that kind of inhibitor. The bundle did not just contain psychoactive plants. It contained, packed together by someone who evidently understood the chemistry involved, plants that only work as strongly as they can in combination. Ethnographic and colonial era accounts across the Andes consistently link this kind of practice to diagnosis, divination, and communication with ancestors or mountain spirits. Questions asked on behalf of a community about what was coming, what had caused an illness, or what a person should do next. The bundle's owner has no name and no grave. What survives is the kit, wrapped as carefully as anything in this list, tucked into rock at the edge of habitable altitude, carried by someone who apparently intended to use it again. Number 3. The Poppy Goddess of Gazi. In 1935, excavations at a late Minoan shrine near the village of Gazi on the north coast of Crete uncovered a terracotta figure just over 75 centimeters tall, a female form with upraised arms in the classic Minoan gesture of Epiphany, the pose associated across Minoan religious art with a deity made visible to a worshipper. On her head, instead of the horns or birds that appear on comparable figures from other Cretan shrines, sit 3 curved, seed-capped stems, unmistakable in shape to anyone who has seen an opium poppy podcut for latex, its surface scored with the diagonal incisions used to release the sap. The figure, now known as the Poppy Goddess, and held in the Heraklion Archaeological Museum, dates to roughly the 13th century BCE, during the final phase of Minoan civilization under Mycenaean influence. It was not an isolated discovery. Similar poppy capsule imagery appears on Minoan seal stones, on gold rings, and most tellingly for the chemistry, on a distinctive class of small ceramic vessel manufactured on Cyprus during the same broad period, and traded in significant numbers to Egypt and the Levant. These vessels, called base ring juglets, are shaped, when inverted, like an opium poppy seed head, incisions and all. The Cypriot archaeologist and museum director Robert Mariles proposed in 1962 that the juglets were purpose-built opium containers, their shape a kind of ancient branding, advertising their contents to a buyer who could not read. The theory sat unproven for decades, resting on shape alone, until residue analysis on surviving juglet fragments began confirming it. Multiple studies since the 1980s, including gas chromatography work on sealed and unsealed examples held in museum collections, have identified opium alkaloid traces inside vessels of exactly this Cypriot form, recovered from sites across Cyprus, mainland Greece, and Egypt, including examples from Egyptian tombs of the New Kingdom. The Gazi figure connects that traded commodity back to the space where a priestess stood in front of it. Minoan shrine models and frescoes consistently show ritual specialists, generally interpreted as priestesses, given the near-total female representation in Minoan cult imagery, positioned as intermediaries who received a deity's presence on behalf of a wider community. What the goddess of Gazi wears on her head is not decorative. It is the plant her worshippers believed let her see or speak for something beyond herself, worn as the identifying mark of her office. Roughly 3,300 years before anyone thought to ask a laboratory to confirm what was inside the jars that plant produced. She stands in the museum today, exactly as she was excavated, arms raised, 3 poppy heads scored and ready, her expression unreadable in the specific way Minoan art tends to leave its faces, which is to say deliberately. Number 2. The barley drink of Eleusis, 22 kilometers west of Athens. On the coastal plain of Eleusis stood the Telesterion, the initiation hall of the Eleusinian mysteries, a rite performed annually for close to 2,000 years, from the Archaic period until the sanctuary was closed by Christian edict in 392 CE. Every autumn, initiates walked the sacred way from Athens, fasted, and on the final night were led into the hall to witness something the ancient sources refuse, with striking consistency to describe. What survives is the shape of the silence around it. Plato, Cicero, Aristotle, Sophocles, and Pindar all refer to the mysteries as the most important religious experience available to a Greek or Roman citizen, and every one of them declines to say what was actually shown. Initiates were bound by an oath of secrecy so absolute that in over 1,000 years of operation, spanning a period that includes some of the most prolific writers in the ancient world, no first-hand account of the central revelation survives. What does survive is the preparatory drink every initiate consumed before entering, called the kykeon, described in the Homeric hymn to Demeter as barley, water, and pennyroyal, fixed and drunk on an empty stomach after days of fasting. In 1978, the ethnomycologist R. Gordon Wasson, the classicist Carl Ruck, and the chemist Albert Hofmann, the same chemist who had first synthesized LSD at Sandoz in 1938, and who understood the chemistry of the ergot fungus better than almost anyone alive, published The Road to Eleusis, proposing that the kykeon's barley had been infected with ergot, Claviceps purpurea, a fungus that grows naturally on grain in the region and produces alkaloids from the same chemical family Hofmann had used to synthesize LSD decades earlier. Ergo, in its raw, uncontrolled form, is dangerous, capable of causing convulsions and gangrene, but certain species of the fungus and certain methods of preparation described in later folk pharmacology from the same region can isolate a fraction with strong psychoactive effect and comparatively low physical toxicity. The hypothesis explained a great deal at once. It explained why every account insists the experience was overwhelming and transformative rather than merely symbolic, why sources describe initiates seeing visions rather than watching a performance, and why a rite performed for a genuinely enormous number of people over 2 millennia on Wasson, Ruck, and Hoffman's argument never produced a documented instance of a wheat-borne poisoning epidemic, which a raw and unrefined ergot dose administered at that scale should eventually have caused. Direct archaeological confirmation remained absent for decades, since the sanctuary itself yields no residue that can be dated with certainty to the kykeon specifically. That changed only partially and only recently. Chemical residue studies on ritual drinking vessels from other sanctuaries in the wider Greek world, including work published in the 2000s and 2010s on sites in Spain and Greece associated with mystery cult practice, have identified ergot alkaloids and other psychoactive plant residues in ceremonial contexts broadly comparable to what the Eleusis hypothesis proposes, without ever recovering a vessel that can be tied to the telesterion itself. The theory remains formally unproven for the specific site where it matters most, resting on classical philology, comparative pharmacology, and analogous residue rather than a smoking cup found at Eleusis. What is not disputed is the outcome the ancient sources describe with total unanimity. People who drank the kykeon and entered the telesterion came out, changed, for the rest of their lives, in a way that made them stop fearing death. Cicero wrote that Athens had given nothing more excellent to the world. The hall where it happened is a ruin of foundation stones now, open to visitors, holding no secret. Anyone standing in it today can any longer be shown. Number 1. The chasm at Delphi. The sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi sits on the southern slope of Mount Parnassus, built directly across a geological fault line where the Gulf of Corinth pulls the earth apart, at a spot ancient tradition held to be the omphalos, the navel of the world. For over 1,000 years, no major decision in the Greek world, a war, a colony, a marriage, a change of law, was considered settled until it had been tested against the words of the Pythia, the priestess who spoke as Apollo. Inside the temple's innermost chamber, the Adyton, the classical descriptions are consistent and specific. The historian Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi himself in the 1st century CE, and so wrote from direct professional knowledge of the sanctuary's operation, described a sweet-smelling vapor, or pneuma, rising from a fissure in the Adyton's floor, and stated that the Pythia sat above it on a tripod to receive it before she prophesied. Strabo and Diodorus Siculus, writing earlier, give similar accounts of a chasm and a rising exhalation. For most of the 20th century, this was treated by archaeologists as invented tradition, since excavation in the early 1900s by French teams found no fissure, no chasm, and geologists confirmed the local bedrock was limestone that does not produce vapors of the kind described. The case was reopened by an unlikely collaboration. In the late 1990s, the geologist Gelle Zelinga de Boer, studying regional fault lines for unrelated purposes, identified that the temple sits at the direct intersection of 2 active faults, and that the local bedrock, rather than being simple limestone, as earlier surveys assumed, contains layers of bituminous, hydrocarbon-rich rock capable of releasing gas when fractured. Working with the classical archaeologist John Hale and the geochemist Geoffrey Chanton, the team published its findings in the journal Geology in 2001, followed by further chemical analysis presented over the following years. Spring water sampled from the immediate area of the temple and travertine deposits formed by ancient water flow through the temple's foundations tested positive for methane and ethylene. Ethylene is the detail that turned a geology paper into a reopened case for the Pythia herself. In small, carefully controlled concentrations, ethylene gas produces a light, euphoric, disconnected trance state, historically used in exactly that concentration as a surgical anesthetic before it was replaced by safer compounds, and it carries a faintly sweet smell, matching Plutarch's description almost precisely. De Boer and Hale argued that a fissure sealed by an ancient earthquake, invisible to the early 20th century excavators because it had literally closed over, had once released gas from these fractured hydrocarbon layers directly into the Adyton, and that the Pythia, seated over it as every source describes, was breathing a low, steady dose of a genuine psychoactive gas for as long as she remained on the tripod. The theory has not gone unchallenged. Some geologists have questioned whether the concentrations detectable in modern samples, taken 2,500 years after the fact, and after extensive earthquake damage to the site, could ever be shown to match what an ancient priestess actually breathed, and whether ethylene alone, without other compounds present in the samples, is sufficient to explain the range of behavior ancient sources attribute to the Pythia, from calm oracular statements to, in a small number of accounts, violent distress. What is not disputed is the geology itself. The faults are real. The bituminous rock is real. The gas traces in the spring water and the travertine are real, measured independently by more than one team since the original study. There is a second detail in the ancient sources that the gas hypothesis accounts for almost incidentally, and it is the detail that separates Delphi from every other site on this list. Pythia was not a hereditary priestess chosen from a ruling family, nor a specialist trained from childhood in a closed tradition, passed master to student. Plutarch is specific that she was, in his own time, an ordinary woman of modest background from the countryside around Delphi, selected for the role as an adult, with no particular preparation beyond ritual purification, ascending the tripod to speak for a god within days of being chosen. A trance requiring years of trained technique does not fit that description. A trance produced by a gas rising reliably out of the ground, available to whoever is sitting in the right place at the right moment, fits it exactly. For over a millennium, kings, generals, and ordinary citizens climbed this mountain to ask a woman sitting over a crack in the earth what was going to happen to them. And for over a millennium, she told them. The temple is a field of broken columns now, the Adyton itself lost beneath collapsed masonry that no excavation has fully cleared, the fault lines still running directly underneath it, doing on a geological clock what they have always done, indifferent to whether anyone is sitting above them to breathe what comes up. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.